Welcome to the Herald Democrat Sports Podcast. I'm the sports editor of the Herald Democrat, Jason De La Rosa, and you're listening to the latest edition of the Herald Democrat Sports Podcast. We have done it. We have made it through an entire football season. Christmas is around the corner, perhaps literally days away as you listen to this podcast, and we are here to recap the Class 3A Division II state championship game that saw Gunter take on Franklin, the last game of the year involving a Texoma team, and unfortunately it did not go the way of the Gunter Tigers as they come up short in their quest for a third state championship in the last 6 seasons. They lose to Franklin 49-35. We'll jump right in. It's the only game we have to talk about, and then we can also give a little recap of the 2021 season as a whole for the Texoma area. And this was a game that we talked about, highly anticipated, number 1 versus number 2. Both teams undefeated, both teams essentially killing everybody that they played this season. Very few close games between the two of them. Last year's runner-up was Franklin. Gunter had won the state championship the year before that. So you have these two programs within this last 5-6 year stretch have been in the mix for a title. Like we mentioned, this was Gunter going for their third. Franklin was going for their first. They had been to the championship game 2015, and then last year hadn't gotten it done, and they were able to get it done this time in a game that was deadlocked through 3 quarters. It was pretty much everything that you would expect out of a state championship matchup between the two best teams. Back and forth, slugging it out. Every time Franklin had a score, Gunter had an answer through the first 3 quarters. And then when Franklin had the next touchdown to go ahead early in the 4th quarter, that was the first time that Gunter was unable to respond. Franklin then scored again, and that led to the final score as both teams ended up going scoreless the final 9.5 minutes. But those 2 long touchdowns early in the 4th quarter ended up being the difference in what was a game, that I said that was really good. Everybody was excited for, especially I think like we said in the preview, but from 4A and below, I think this was the game for people to watch, and it really lived up to the billing. We talked about Franklin and what they could do with the slot T, and they did it. They ran for a Class 3A state championship game record, 523 yards on 56 carries. They did attempt 3 passes. They didn't complete them, so all their yards came on the ground. And when you're averaging about 9 yards a carry, you probably don't need to do a whole lot else. And in this case, you had nearly 3 100-yard rushers. The big name in this one was Malcolm Murphy. He was the offensive MVP, and for good reason. He had 15 carries for 280 yards and 4 touchdowns. He had 3 of them were of 59 yards or longer, and then he had both of the touchdowns in the 4th quarter. First a 61-yard run, and then an 86-yard run after Gunter got stopped. After Franklin went up 42-35, Gunter went 3 and out, punted, and then the very first play, despite being backed up to the 14-yard line, Murphy was able to break loose and have an 86-yard touchdown run to give Franklin the 2-score margin. Kind of forced Gunter into having to throw when it was obvious that's what they were going to do to try to get back in this game. And then Murphy actually came up with a couple of interceptions on defense to maintain that 2-touchdown lead and preserve the win. He also got some help, though. Bryson Washington, 17 carries for 165 yards and 3 touchdowns. I thought he was in line to be the offensive MVP early in the 3rd quarter when he got his 3rd touchdown, and then Murphy just broke things open there in that race. And then Bobby Washington didn't get to the end zone, but he also had 18 carries for 96 yards, and that was essentially all of the yardage and almost all of the carries. A couple other guys had 1 carry that lost yardage. One of those was a sack, and then the kneel down. So, a dominant performance by Franklin. I know a lot of people expected that. A lot of people said Gunter was going to have trouble, and they did in the respect that when you look at the raw numbers, they weren't able to make things happen. They did have 2 turnovers, and Franklin put the ball on the deck a couple other times. They got some lucky bounces that avoided some further ones, including on the very first run of the game. Deep in their territory. Bryson Washington had the ball bounce right back up to him, and on a play to the outside where there was nobody else there except for him and about 3 or 4 Gunter defenders that were going to chase him down. And if that ball bounces away, who knows what happens there? Just maybe set a different tone. But Gunter knew what they were getting. Coach Fizzell said after the game, there were some plays where Franklin was able to get outside. And obviously they are the state champs for a reason. They're 16-0. If Franklin makes an extra point last year and then wins in overtime against Canadian, we're talking about the defending champs, winning another title with a large core of those guys back. And so someone was going to lose this game. I know somebody tweeted late in the game. I think it might have been when it was 35-35. Nobody's going to lose this game. Somebody's going to run out of time. And it felt that way because, like I said, every time Franklin came up with a punch, Gunter was there to respond, and they punched straight back with a touchdown. And to touch on some of that, we discussed as a preview if Gunter was going to have a chance to kind of counterbalance. It was to have the advantage in the passing game, to get some of that yardage back that Franklin was going to gain on the ground. And we mentioned Franklin didn't complete a pass; they had 0 yards. Hudson Graham was able to throw for 149 yards and 3 touchdowns. 2 of those were to Cole Lemons. He finished with 3 catches for 37 yards. Ethan Sloan had 4 catches for 82 yards and a touchdown as well. And then rushing, Saul Rodriguez actually led. He had 2 carries for 61 yards. Graham added 14 for 57. Braden Hinton had 12 for 53 and a touchdown. And Sloan added 10 for 46 and a touchdown as well. And that was the contrast of the game. When you hear those numbers, Gunter was able to grind out 4, 5, 6 yards to keep those drives going and then hit on some of those big plays in the passing game. While Franklin obviously had some really big plays in the run game. They had out of their 7 touchdown runs, one's 59 yards, one's 66 yards, one's 61 yards, and one's 86 yards. So they had plenty of home run capability. While Gunter had to grind out some of their drives. When they went to the air, they had a little more pickup on some of those big plays. Unfortunately, towards the end, it was when you're down 2 scores, you have the ball and there's about 7 minutes left. You can't have a drive that takes up 5 minutes to get down the field because you're picking up 4 and 5 yards a pop at a time. They kind of had to force the action there. But for 3 quarters, this was everything that you wanted. Like we said, somebody was going to lose, somebody was going to win. That's just the law of playing in a state championship game. And unfortunately, Gunter was able to come up short in this one. And you look at this run that they've been on. Like I said, no matter what happened, it was going to be another amazing bullet point. I put this out there after the game on Thursday night. Here, you go just year by year, and you look at the now 6 years and counting of what they've been able to do, and you go, we're 16-0 with the state championship. Then we went 15-1, and we're the state runner-up. So the only loss is to the runner-up. 14-1, with the only loss coming in the state semifinals. 15-1 and the state championship. 33-2, lose in the state semifinals for one of those losses, and that's to the eventual champion. And then 15-1 this year with a state runner-up. So that's a record of 88-6. in the last 6 years with 2 championships, 2 runner-ups, and 2 semifinals. And out of those 6 losses, three of your 6 losses were to the eventual state champion. I mean, it's just been an amazing run. I know in the moment, it's hard to just say how great things have been, and obviously big things are expected again next year. We've talked about it in realignment. Gunter is going to stay down in 3A Division II. Of note, Franklin will be moving to Division I, so there's not a chance for a rematch. We can't hope that there's a little bit of a revenge factor, and these two could meet up again in the state championship game because Franklin's going to move up. So there will be a new 3A Division II champion no matter what happens. But I would imagine Gunter's gonna enter the season as the number 1 team in the state rankings. Depending on how their schedule works out, I would imagine there's a good chance that they go undefeated in the regular season. They're obviously the favorites to win the region again, depending on some crazy realignment thing. Obviously, we will know more about that on February. And another big reason, obviously, when you talk about why they would be favored, and a reason why a lot of people had them in the rankings as the number 2 team this year, not just because of the reputation, not just because of the fact that they made the Final Four last year and lost to the eventual champion. They brought back a ton of those guys, and a lot of that can be said again this year. Obviously, there's going to be a change at quarterback. With Hudson Graham going on to Texas Tech, and that's a great athlete that you're going to lose. A guy who ran for over 1,200 yards, threw for over 1,600 yards, had a hand in a lot of touchdowns. And there's a lot of you can kind of go down the list a little bit. Obviously, so you lose the quarterback, you're going to lose a big play receiver guy in Cole Lemons. Not just that on offense, but on defense as well. So that's 2 spots that you're going to have to fill there. Some guys on the defensive line, on the offensive line. When you want to throw out some of those names, like a Grayson Toney, Sean McClure, Lane Dopede. You've got a lot of guys. I'm just kind of scrolling down to make sure, because I'm sure I'm going to miss some people along the way. But you're gonna lose guys on both sides of the line. You're gonna lose a kicker, a guy who's been in that spot for multiple years. So obviously that's gonna affect the special teams. And then even though you played the last half of this year without him, you're losing a guy like Caden Rigsby at the linebacker spot, Saul Rodriguez at the linebacker spot. There's a lot of senior leadership. Last year's group only lost 2. This year's group, loses considerably more than that. But then, we talk about the guys, excuse me, that are coming back. Obviously, first and foremost on that list is going to be Ethan Sloan, what he can do both as a runner and a receiver. And then you throw in, either some of the guys that contributed a little more from last year, but also kind of burst on the scene this year, whether that is the continued play of Ashton Bennett on both sides of the ball. You throw in a guy like Cannon Lemberg at receiver, who probably moves into that number 1 role with Lemons gone. Ivy Hellman is a guy on both sides of the ball, another junior this year. Adam Reed, starter at linebacker, who's a junior. There's a lot of talent that still is going to be back. And as we've seen throughout this run, there are guys that we don't really see along the way. They either come out of nowhere or are in the pipeline that have been blocked by some of these upperclassmen who have been multiple year starters, and then they step in. We saw that this year with I know Braden Hinton played a little bit last year, but you really saw him emerge this year on both sides of the ball with what he was able to do as a sophomore. And I think with as much participation, that they opened 2-a-days, with almost 100 kids in the program. That's amazing for a 3A Division I team, let alone a 3A Division II team. So there's a lot of depth there, and that's one of those things we saw throughout the year. They were able to beat people by such a large margin that they could get guys reps. They could put people out on the field and see what they could do to prepare them for, when you have to replace a Cooper Wade at safety, when you have to find a guy, when you move a Trey Oblas for his final year from off the offensive line to a tight end spot. You can do that because you have the different combinations, it's at some of the other spots because you have that depth, and you don't have to rely on only 2 or 3 guys because they're that good. So, big things expected for Gunter next year. Like I said, I think they'll go into the season as the number 1 team, unless they give that to Franklin. A lot of those guys on Franklin, are upperclassmen. If you're looking at 3A as a whole, but like I said, they're moving up to Division I. So if we're just talking Division II, I don't know where you want to rank them. Obviously, Canadians is always really good. If you want to base it off this year, I know that's kind of hard. You look at a Lubbock Roosevelt team that won Region 1. A lot of those guys were seniors. Coming off that best year ever. Wascom, I would imagine. I don't know. I'd have to double check on if Wascom is moving up, but they played Franklin to a 2-touchdown margin as well. So I could easily see Gunter at number 1, maybe Wascom at number 2, depending on what they lose. I'd have to double check on their roster and who they bring back from a team that was able to make the state semifinals on that side of the bracket. So big things expected there. Another great season. I think across Texoma as a whole, it's always interesting to see what the storylines end up turning out to be. Obviously Gunter has always been the last team standing. These last 6 years, you mix in Pottsboro a couple years ago. I guess technically Gunter was the last team standing because they played after Pottsboro. But it seems like every year there's sort of some different storylines. Obviously, Whitesboro having the best year they've ever had. I think they're going to be looked at very fondly, depending on what realignment does with them out in Region 1 if they stay out there. I think they'll be one of the favorites for 3A Division 1. Van Alstyne had one of its better seasons in a while. They had that second year adjustment up in 4A. They brought back a ton of guys. They were so young last year, and they get that first taste. They turned that into getting past the first round, being able to go on a little bit of a run there in a very loaded district. They finished third in district behind the 2 best teams in the region. Salina and Aubrey made it to the region final. There's no shame in finishing third in that district, and we'll see what happens with realignment with them. And then, of course, Sherman Denison having new coaches and seeing where these programs go to see what happened in the first year and the transition of what the Bearcats and the Jackets will look like going forward under that new leadership, and where things go from there. And obviously, knowing that the Battle of the Axe is kicking off yet another season to see what happens there. We'll have a coaching change at Howe. That's the only one as of right now that we know of. And we talked about the Bulldogs dropping down for the next 2 years to Division II. So that's going to be interesting to see if they're able to take care of that. You could probably touch on everybody in Texoma because there's always something interesting. I think those are probably the top 4 or 5 highlights from this year to kind of see where things go in the future. If we're looking ahead to 2022 and beyond, and this of course is pre-realignment talk. Obviously, like we mentioned, I think Gunter, if they're not the favorite to win the whole thing next year, they're obviously going to be at the top of the list. I'm interested to see where Whitesboro comes in that pecking order in 3A Division 1. based on what they were able to do this year. They have some of those key guys back. They'll have to find some playmakers that they lose a bunch of those senior guys that really stepped up in that playoff run. Obviously, it's going to be tough if they do stay out there because Brock is going to be staying down in 3A. So obviously, at best, you're looking at a potential rematch in the region final. I think White Wright moving down into 2A. I'm interested to see what happens with them if they end up in that district with Tioga and Tom Bean. What that could look like for White Wright moving down. They were a borderline playoff team the last couple of years. They're going to have some turnover, but I think moving down to 2A Division I could turn into something for them. Can Bells keep the run that they've been on? Getting to the region semifinals 2 of the last 3 years. Can they be in a position to do that again next year? What Tioga was able to do in the first year under Chad Rogers, can they carry that momentum beyond just making the playoffs? Are they going to be a real threat in whatever district they're in? I think that's something to watch for sure. And obviously what happens with Hal with a coaching change. There's always really good storylines. I think that's some of the things to really watch for going forward next year. We'll do this again in a couple of months. When realignment comes out, we'll talk about not just what the football ramifications of that will be, but also what happens to some of the other sports when those districts come out, because that you never know what's going to happen in realignment. We've had splits. We've had in 3A the last couple of years. We've had a good chunk of those teams together. They could get split for whatever reason. It's going to be interesting to see what happens, obviously, because White Wright's dropping down to 2A. So what does that mean? Not just for their football program, but for what district they get put in terms of volleyball and baseball and softball. So we'll go in depth. I don't know if I'll do a preview of that, because I think what we talked about last week for in regards to Snapshot Day and the cutoffs, I think I went into that a little bit there. I think I'll do a pretty deep dive into what happens once the districts and realignment is complete, because I think that's obviously what everybody wants to know, and how that affects their team, and what changes will be in store for the next 2 years. So short and sweet this week, because obviously we only have the one game. So congrats to Gunter on another great season. To get as far as they did, it's really hard, one just to win the region, and then another just to get to a championship game, let alone have a game that was as good as it was for as long as it was. For those who paid attention to the weekends, some of those games got kind of out of hand. Everybody was really stoked that Gunter and Franklin were able to go punch for punch, and I think Gunter just came up one punch too short to take that down to the wire for sure. I hope everybody has a Merry Christmas and enjoy your break. I guess unless you're a basketball player who has some tournaments to play in, have a Happy New Year. And we will get back together as we recap realignment the first week of February. So be on the lookout for that. Again, I thank you all for listening. Thanks for listening all season. We do the best we can here on the podcast. Try to give you some information. I hope you take advantage of that. And I thank you all for listening. And we will talk to you in February.